In the village of Ashworth, Yorkshire, the Higgins family of four vanished without a trace from their cottage in the autumn of 1965. Just another unsolved case in the files of the local constabulary. Their disappearance would have remained, if not for what investigators discovered 3 months later. Beneath St. Mary's Church, in a hidden room, they found the personal belongings of the Higgins family alongside detailed journal entries that described rituals the Church of England had officially banned centuries ago. Dated 2 weeks after the family's reported disappearance was the strangest part, the final entry. For nearly 60 years, the church has refused to comment on the discovery, and to this day, the cottage where the Higgins family lived remains abandoned. Even more disturbing is what makes this case so chilling. When investigators finally gained access to sealed church records in 1985, they discovered the Higgins family was not the first to disappear under these mysterious circumstances. Based on documents never before made public, including testimony from the only surviving witness who has finally agreed to break 40 years of silence, tonight I will reveal what really happened in that quiet Yorkshire village. Before we continue with the story of the Higgins family and their connection to St. Mary's Church, know that this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest mysteries that others won't tell. If you are one of those true mystery seekers, subscribe now and let me know in the comments what country you're listening from. The stories we tell here, stories that authorities tried to bury forever, are tales few channels dare to tell. Now, let's step into the shadows of 1965 Yorkshire and discover what terror waited in Ashworth village. Everything the residents believed about their quiet, God-fearing village would be challenged by what unfolded in that small Yorkshire community, revealing a conspiracy of silence that had protected unspeakable secrets for nearly half a century. Ashworth was the kind of village where time seemed to move differently, where memories of 8 centuries of human habitation were held by the ancient stone walls. Nestled deep in the Yorkshire Dales and surrounded by rolling hills that turned purple with heather each autumn, it was home to barely 300 souls, most of whom could trace their families back 5 or 6 generations in the same handful of cottages. The village centered around St. Mary's Church, a magnificent Norman structure that dominated the landscape with its weathered limestone tower rising nearly 100 feet into the Yorkshire sky. Built in 1187 on the site of an even older Saxon chapel, local folklore claimed the location had been considered sacred long before Christianity arrived in the Dales. Ominously in the wind that constantly swept down from the moors, the massive oak doors, reinforced with iron bands that had turned black with age, creaked. An unusual chill that seemed to settle into the very bones of the village was brought to Yorkshire by the autumn of 1965. Earlier than anyone could remember, the leaves turned, painting the hillsides in deep crimsons and golds that appeared almost unnatural in their intensity. Each evening around sunset, a persistent fog began settling over the valley, clinging to the ancient stones of St. Mary's like a living thing. So thick was the fog that many residents reported feeling disoriented when walking through the churchyard at dusk, as if the familiar paths had somehow shifted in the mist. Different that autumn began to sound the church bells, which for hundreds of years had rung punctually to mark the hours and call the faithful to worship. The first to notice was Mrs. Agnes Peaton, who had lived next to the church for 63 years. A deeper, more resonant tone than she remembered was now produced by the bronze bells, as if the very air had thickened around them. Sometimes, late at night, she would swear she heard the bells ringing when they shouldn't be, soft, mournful peals that seemed to come from underground rather than the tower above. A man whose life ran like clockwork was Thomas Arthur Higgins. At 38 years old, he had inherited both his methodical nature and his position at the village post office from his father, who had inherited them from his father before him. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, from his cottage on Church Lane, Thomas would emerge, dressed in his carefully pressed suit and carrying his worn leather satchel. He would walk his 2 children, Margaret Rose, aged 12, and young William Thomas, age 8, to the village school before continuing to his work, sorting mail and managing telegrams for the entire valley. A quiet man who kept his thoughts to himself, Thomas was described by those who knew him well as deeply religious in the traditional Yorkshire way, devout, but not demonstrative, faithful, but practical. At St. Mary's, he served as a church warden and could be found every Sunday morning ensuring that the hymnals were properly arranged and the collection plates were clean. As steady and reliable as the Yorkshire hills themselves was his faith, which made what happened to him even more incomprehensible to those who knew him. As a young bride 15 years earlier, Eleanina Mary Higgins née Whitlock had come to Ashworth. At 35, she retained the striking beauty that had first caught Thomas's attention at a church social in nearby halls. Her dark hair, which she wore in a practical style befitting a village mother, still caught the light in a way that made her appear younger than her years. With the same methodical precision that characterized the entire Higgins family, Eleanina managed their small cottage. But about her nature there was something more restless, a curiosity about the world that sometimes put her at odds with the conservative traditions of village life. Always interested in local history and folklore, Eleanina spent hours in the village library, reading about the ancient customs of the Yorkshire dales. Filled with herbs and wild flowers, she kept a garden that many of the older villagers recognized as plants their grandmothers had grown for purposes that were no longer discussed in polite company. When questioned about her unusual botanical interests, Eleanina would smile and mention that she enjoyed keeping the old traditions alive, though she was never specific about which traditions she meant. The pride of the village school were the Higgins children. A serious, thoughtful girl who excelled in her studies and helped her mother with household duties without complaint was Margaret Rose. She had inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's steady temperament, though teachers noticed that she sometimes seemed older than her 12 years, as if she carried knowledge that weighed heavily on her young shoulders. Margaret loved to read, particularly books about history and mythology, and she could often be found in the churchyard copying inscriptions from the oldest headstones into a notebook she carried everywhere. The village's acknowledged charmer was William Thomas, known to everyone as Billy. At 8 years old, he possessed an infectious laugh and a curiosity about everything around him that endeared him to every adult in Ashworth. Particularly fascinated by the church, he spent hours examining the carved stone gargoyles that decorated the exterior walls and asking endless questions about the meaning of the stained glass windows. A habit of drawing constantly was Billy's, filling notebook after notebook with sketches of the church, the surrounding countryside, and, increasingly as autumn progressed, disturbing images that his teacher found difficult to interpret. According to rhythms that had been established centuries earlier, the village of Ashworth operated. Every Thursday, market day was still held in the small square beside the church, though the merchants now arrived by motorcar rather than horse and cart. The unofficial town hall was the pub, the Shepherd's Rest, where news was shared and opinions were formed. The post office doubled as a general store, and the village school taught children from 5 to 14 before they were sent to the larger town of Horses for their final education. But beneath this veneer of rural tranquility, Ashworth harbored secrets that went back generations. The village had always been isolated, not just geographically, but culturally. Traditions and observances that outsiders rarely glimpsed were maintained by the old families, the Whitlocks, the Carrs, the Thorntons, and a handful of others. These families intermarried regularly and shared knowledge that was passed down through carefully chosen bloodlines. The village librarian and unofficial keeper of local law was Mrs. Margaret Thornton, a descendant of one of Ashworth's founding families. Her cottage contained books and manuscripts that had been collected over centuries, including texts that the church had tried to suppress during various periods of religious reform. A small, bird-like woman in her 70s who spoke in whispers, Mrs. Thornton seemed to know everyone's business before they knew it themselves. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to what she called preserving our heritage. Another member of the old families was Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician. At 55, he had returned to Ashworth after studying medicine in Edinburgh, bringing with him modern medical knowledge that he somehow managed to blend with older healing traditions that his grandmother had taught him. Detailed records not just of his patients' physical health, but of what he called their spiritual well-being, were maintained by Dr. Carr, though he was always vague about what exactly this meant. One of the few authority figures in Ashworth who was not connected to the old families was the local constable, Sergeant Robert Henley. He had been assigned to the village 5 years earlier and had gradually become aware that there were aspects of village life that remained hidden from him. A thorough, methodical man who took pride in understanding his territory completely, Henley found his inability to penetrate certain aspects of Ashworth's social structure a source of increasing frustration. For 23 years, Reverend Harold Whitmore had served St. Mary's, arriving in Ashworth as a young curate, fresh from theological college. From an energetic advocate of church reform into something much more complex and troubling, he had transformed over the decades. Filled with ancient manuscripts, archaeological artifacts, and books on subjects that seemed to have little connection to conventional Anglican theology was his study, located in the rectory beside the church. A tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair, Reverend Whitmore had eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Over the years, his sermons had grown increasingly esoteric, filled with references to older truths and deeper mysteries that left many parishioners confused and unsettled. Yet he remained popular among certain members of the congregation, particularly those from the old families who seemed to understand references that escaped everyone else. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, changes in the Higgins family's behavior were noticed by several residents of Ashworth. Subtle at first were the alterations, Eleanina spending more time in the churchyard, Thomas appearing distracted and worried, the children becoming more withdrawn. But as October progressed, these changes became impossible to ignore. The first to notice Eleanina's nocturnal activities was Mrs. Agnes Peaton, whose cottage shared a garden wall with the Higgins property. Beginning in early October, Eleanor had taken to spending long hours in St. Mary's churchyard after dark, often carrying what appeared to be bundles of herbs, flowers, and other items that Mrs. Peaton couldn't identify in the moonlight. When she worked up the courage to ask Eleanina about these midnight excursions, the younger woman simply smiled and replied, "I'm tending to old traditions, Mrs. Peaton. Someone has to keep the proper observances." Nothing to Mrs. Peaton was the phrase of proper observances, but it left her with a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. Pleasant enough had been Eleanina's tone, but there was something in her eyes that suggested depths of knowledge that made the older woman uncomfortable. Mrs. Peaton began keeping her curtains drawn after dark and found excuses to avoid conversations with her neighbor. Significant changes in Eleanina's purchasing habits during October were noticed by Mr. Arthur Finch, who owned the village's general store. She had always been a careful shopper, buying only what her family needed and maintaining strict household accounts. But suddenly, she was purchasing large quantities of unusual items, pounds of coarse salt, dozens of white candles, and what she described as specific herbs from old Mrs. Wetherb, the village's unofficial herbalist who grew medicinal and culinary plants in her extensive cottage garden. When Mr. Finch commented on these unusual purchases, Eleanina explained that she was preparing for the harvest season. Though this explanation made little sense, given that the Higgins family had never maintained more than a small kitchen garden, the items she was buying seemed more suited to some kind of ceremonial purpose than any practical household use. But Mr. Finch was too polite to pursue the matter further. Increasingly concerned about the behavior of the Higgins children during October became the village school teacher, Miss Sarah Collins. Margaret, who had always been an excellent student, became distracted and withdrawn. Often she was caught staring out the classroom window toward St. Mary's Church, and when called upon to answer questions, she would respond as if awakening from a dream. Filled with references to ancient wisdom and forgotten truths that seemed far too sophisticated for a 12-year-old, her essays, once models of clear thinking and proper grammar, became. Even more alarming was young Billy's behavior. The normally cheerful and talkative boy had become obsessed with drawing, spending every free moment creating the same disturbing image over and over again. The drawing showed robed figures standing around what appeared to be an altar with symbols that Miss Collins didn't recognize, but that somehow made her profoundly uncomfortable. When she asked Billy to explain his artwork, he would only say that he was drawing what Mommy and Mr. Whitmore taught me about the old church. Miss Collins attempted to discuss her concerns with Thomas during a parent conference in mid-October, but found him evasive and clearly distressed. Thomas admitted that Eleanina had become involved in what he called historical research with Reverend Whitmore and several other village residents, but insisted that it was just academic study. However, his manner suggested that he was far from comfortable with whatever was happening in his household. Innocuously enough, in 1962 had begun the organization that would eventually be revealed as the center of Ashworth's dark secrets. Reverend Whitmore had proposed forming a group to study the historical traditions of the Yorkshire Dales with particular emphasis on the pre-Christian customs that had shaped local culture for centuries before the arrival of Christianity. The group initially consisted of 5 members: Reverend Whitmore himself, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, Dr. Edmund Carr, Mrs. Dorothy Wetherb, the herbalist, and Mr. James Crawford, a retired schoolmaster who had moved to Ashworth from London. In the church vestry, the group met monthly, ostensibly to discuss historical documents and archaeological evidence relating to ancient Yorkshire traditions. The Ashworth Historical Preservation Society was what they called themselves, claiming to be working on a comprehensive study of local folklore that would eventually be published as a book for the benefit of future generations. In the spring of 1964, Elelonina Higgins joined the group, drawn by her long-standing interest in local history and encouraged by Reverend Whitmore, who had noticed her extensive reading on folklore and traditional customs. An enthusiastic and dedicated member, Elelonina proved to be, contributing research on herbal medicine and seasonal celebrations that impressed the other participants with its depth and authenticity. What the public didn't know was that the Historical Preservation Society's activities had gradually evolved far beyond academic research. By 1963, the group had begun what they called practical demonstrations of ancient rituals, initially justifying these activities as necessary for understanding the historical contexts they were studying. Simply enough started these demonstrations, seasonal celebrations based on agricultural cycles, herbal preparation techniques that had been used for centuries, and meditation practices that they claimed were derived from Celtic spiritual traditions. However, under Reverend Whitmore's guidance, these practices had grown increasingly complex and disturbing. The vicar had convinced the group that true understanding of ancient traditions required not just intellectual study, but experimental participation. He argued that the early church had suppressed valuable spiritual knowledge and that recovering these traditions was not only academically important but spiritually necessary. By the time Elelonina joined, the group was meeting twice monthly with additional special observances scheduled around what they called significant dates in the ancient calendar. In a room beneath St. Mary's Church that Reverend Whitmore claimed to have discovered during renovation work, these observances took place. The room, he explained, had been used for religious purposes long before the current church was built and represented a direct connection to the spiritual practices of their ancestors. Elelonina's enthusiasm for the group's work impressed all the members, but it was her suggestion that families should participate together in certain rituals that marked a turning point in the organization's development. She argued that many ancient traditions were specifically designed around family units and that incomplete participation might actually be dangerous, potentially leaving rituals unfinished in ways that could have negative consequences. Initially skeptical of his wife's involvement with the Historical Preservation Society, Thomas Higgins had been gradually won over by Elelonina's obvious happiness and intellectual stimulation. She would return from meetings filled with excitement about new discoveries and insights, sharing stories about Yorkshire's hidden history that fascinated even Thomas's practical mind. When Elelonina suggested that he might enjoy attending some of the group's presentations, Thomas agreed to visit one of their regular meetings. Harmless enough seemed the meeting Thomas attended in June 1964. Reverend Whitmore had prepared a lecture about medieval agricultural practices, complete with historical documents and artifacts that he had borrowed from various local collections. Clearly knowledgeable and passionate about their research were the other members, and Thomas found himself genuinely interested in learning about the farming techniques that his own ancestors might have used centuries earlier. However, as months passed and Elelonina became increasingly involved with the group's activities, Thomas began to notice troubling changes in his wife's behavior and attitudes. She started speaking critically of modern religious practices, suggesting that contemporary Christianity had lost essential spiritual knowledge that ancient traditions preserved. She began keeping unusual schedules, staying up late to read obscure texts that Reverend Whitmore had given her, and waking before dawn to tend to plants and preparations that seemed to have no practical purpose. Most disturbing to Thomas was Eleanor's growing insistence that the children should be educated about the old ways. She began teaching Margaret and Billy about herbal medicine, seasonal celebrations, and what she called proper respect for the forces that shape our world. The children seemed to enjoy these lessons initially, but Thomas noticed that they were becoming secretive about what they learned, sharing private jokes and references that he didn't understand. In September 1965, Thomas decided to speak directly with Reverend Whitmore about his concerns. He arranged a private meeting in the vicar's study, intending to discuss Elelonina's growing obsession with the historical group and its effect on their family life. What he discovered during that conversation would haunt him for the few remaining weeks of his life. In his study, a room that had always seemed cluttered with books and papers but now appeared almost overwhelming in its density of strange artifacts and unfamiliar texts, Reverend Whitmore received Thomas. The vicar listened patiently as Thomas explained his worries, nodding sympathetically and asking thoughtful questions about specific examples of Elelonina's changed behavior. But when Thomas finished speaking, not what he had expected was Reverend Whitmore's response. Instead of offering reassurance or suggesting ways to moderate Ellenina's involvement with the group, the vicar launched into an explanation of why the family's participation in the Historical Society's work was not just beneficial but essential. He spoke about spiritual obligations that transcended individual preferences, about ancient responsibilities that certain families were chosen to fulfill, and about the dangerous consequences of abandoning traditions that had protected the community for generations. More confused and concerned than ever, Thomas left that meeting. An undercurrent of threat that Thomas couldn't quite identify, but definitely felt, had been carried by Reverend Whitmore's words. The vicar had made it clear that the Higgins family's continued participation in the group's activities was not merely desired, but required, though he had never explicitly stated what might happen if they chose to withdraw. An acceleration of strange events in Ashworth that seemed to center around the Higgins family was brought by October 1965. Ellenina's activities became more intensive and secretive, with multiple trips to the church each week and constant preparation of materials whose purpose she would not explain to her increasingly worried husband. More erratic became the children's behavior, with both Margaret and Billy displaying knowledge and using vocabulary that seemed far beyond their years. That Thomas visited his office 3 times during October, displaying symptoms of severe anxiety and what the physician described as acute nervous exhaustion, would later be testified by Dr. Edmund Carr. Thomas complained of insomnia, loss of appetite, and what he called a feeling of impending doom that he couldn't shake. When Dr. Carr pressed him for details about the source of his distress, Thomas would only say that Eleanor had become involved in activities that he feared were dangerous for the whole family. During his final visit to Dr. Carr's office on October 25, Thomas appeared to be on the verge of a complete breakdown. Rapidly and incoherently, he spoke about ancient obligations and ceremonies that can't be stopped once they begin. He asked Dr. Carr about the symptoms of what he called religious mania and whether there were medical treatments for people who had become convinced they were receiving supernatural communications. Most disturbing, Thomas asked Dr. Carr whether he believed it was possible for old evil to persist in places where terrible things had happened in the past. When the doctor asked what had prompted this question, Thomas replied that Ellenina had been spending time in parts of the church that he was certain had never been open to the public before, and that she claimed to be receiving guidance from sources that existed beyond the ordinary world. That Thomas speak with Reverend Whitmore about his spiritual concerns was recommended by Dr. Carr, advice that he would spend the rest of his life regretting. What Dr. Carr didn't know was that the vicar was not a source of help for the Higgins family, but the primary architect of their doom. Dramatic changes to the Higgins household that were noticed by everyone who knew the family were brought by the final week of October. Ellenina stopped attending her usual social obligations and was rarely seen outside her cottage except for trips to the church. The children stopped playing with their friends and appeared increasingly pale and withdrawn. Several days of work were missed by Thomas, something that had never happened in his 15 years at the post office. Sounds from the Higgins cottage that she couldn't identify were later recalled by Mrs. Peaton: rhythmic chanting, the burning of substances that produced unusually acrid smoke, and conversations conducted in voices so low that she couldn't make out words, but could detect emotional intensity that made her increasingly uncomfortable. On several occasions, she observed unusual visitors arriving at the Higgins cottage after dark, figures in dark clothing who moved with purposeful silence and never stayed longer than an hour. A Sunday that dawned grey and cold was October 31, 1965, with the persistent fog that had plagued Ashworth all autumn hanging so low that the top of St. Mary's Tower was completely obscured. Normally proceeded the morning service with the Higgins family occupying their customary pew in the third row. However, several parishioners later recalled that the family's behavior during the service had been distinctly unusual. With an expression of intense concentration throughout Reverend Whitmore's sermon, which focused on the theme of ancient covenants and their persistence through time, Ellenina Saturday. She appeared to be taking notes in a small leather journal, something she had never done during church services before. Rigidly beside her, Thomas sat, his face pale and his hands clenched in his lap. Unusually quiet were the children, sitting perfectly still in a way that seemed unnatural for youngsters their age. Unlike his usual presentations was Reverend Whitmore's sermon itself. He spoke about obligations that transcend individual choice and the wisdom of traditions that predate our current understanding. Several references to tonight's observance and the importance of completing what has been begun were made by him, phrases that meant nothing to most of the congregation, but clearly had special significance for certain members. After the service, the Higgins family was seen walking home together, but their movement seemed somehow different from their usual Sunday routine. Instead of the leisurely pace they typically maintained, they walked quickly and purposefully, as if they had urgent business awaiting them. Mrs. Peaton, who was tending her garden when they passed, later recalled that none of them acknowledged her greeting, something that was completely out of character for the normally polite family. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon was the last confirmed sighting of the complete Higgins family when Mr. Finch observed them entering their cottage and closing the door firmly behind them. What happened next would only be pieced together months later from evidence found in the hidden chambers beneath St. Mary's Church. That the lights in the Higgins cottage were extinguished earlier than usual that evening was noticed by Mrs. Peaton. By 8 o'clock, the house was completely dark, something that had never happened before on a Sunday night, when the family traditionally spent the evening reading and preparing for the week ahead. When she peered through her curtains at 10 o'clock, she could see no signs of life in the cottage at all. But it was sometime after midnight on October 31st that Mrs. Peaton witnessed the event that would haunt her for the rest of her life. By sounds that she initially thought were part of a dream, she was awakened. Distant chanting that seemed to rise and fall with a rhythm that was both hypnotic and deeply disturbing. When she realized that the sounds were real, she moved to her bedroom window to investigate their source. What she saw in St. Mary's churchyard defied rational explanation. Figures carrying candles or torches were moving in what appeared to be a procession around the church building. The figures were dressed in dark robes that obscured their identities, but their movements were purposeful and coordinated, suggesting a ceremony that had been carefully planned and rehearsed. For what seemed like hours, the chanting continued, rising and falling in intensity, but never stopping completely. Certain that she could hear children's voices among the adult ones was Mrs. Peaton, high and clear notes that stood out against the deeper tones of the adult participants. The sound made her feel physically ill, though she couldn't explain why. Most disturbing of all, the procession eventually disappeared. Mrs. Pemberton watched as the figures moved toward the church building and simply vanished, as if the ancient stone walls had opened to receive them. The lights continued to flicker in the churchyard for several more hours, but she never saw the participants emerge. What would become one of the most perplexing missing persons investigations in Yorkshire history began on Monday morning, November 1, 1965. When Thomas failed to appear at the post office by his usual time of 8:15 a.m., his supervisor, Mr. Gregory Walsh, initially assumed that the family was dealing with illness or some other temporary emergency. However, when repeated telephone calls to the Higgins cottage went unanswered, Mr. Walsh decided to investigate personally. He walked to Church Lane and knocked on the cottage door, receiving no response. When he peered through the windows, he could see that the interior appeared neat and undisturbed, but there were no signs of current occupation. Empty in a way that suggested the absence was not temporary, felt the cottage. Mr. Walsh contacted Sergeant Robert Henley, who arrived at the cottage within 30 minutes to begin a preliminary investigation. What Henley found would puzzle him for months and eventually lead to discoveries that would shake the entire community of Ashworth to its foundation. Unlocked was the cottage door, something that was unusual, but not unprecedented in a village where most residents trusted their neighbors completely. Immaculately clean and organized was the interior with no signs of struggle, hasty departure, or foul play. In their expected places were the family's personal belongings, Eleanina's purse hanging on its usual hook, Thomas's wallet in the dresser drawer where he always kept it, the children's school clothes laid out for Monday morning. In the kitchen, Henley found evidence that the family had prepared and eaten Sunday dinner. The dishes had been washed and put away, and there were no signs that a meal had been interrupted or abandoned. However, he did notice that certain items seemed to be missing from their usual locations: candles that Mrs. Peaton had mentioned seeing in the cottage, several books from Eleanina's collection of folklore texts, and what appeared to be some of the herbal preparations that she had been working on in recent weeks. Most puzzling was the discovery in Thomas's small study. On his desk lay an open Bible turned to the Book of Revelation, chapter 20, which deals with the binding of Satan and the judgment of the dead. Written in the margin in what appeared to be Eleanor's handwriting was a single line: the old covenant must be honored at all costs. Below it, in Thomas's more angular script, were the words, "God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back." The entire day conducting interviews with every resident of Ashworth who might have information about the family's disappearance was spent by Sergeant Henley. Troubling and contradictory was the picture that emerged from these conversations. While everyone agreed that the Higgins family had been acting strangely in recent weeks, no one could provide specific information about where they might have gone or why they would have left without telling anyone. Quickly revealed by Henley's investigation was that several key members of the community were being less than forthright about their knowledge of the family's activities. When questioned about the Historical Preservation Society, Reverend Whitmore acknowledged that Elelanina had been an active member, but insisted that the group's activities were purely academic and couldn't possibly be connected to the disappearance. However, when Henley pressed for details about the group's recent meetings and activities, the vicar became evasive and defensive. Whitmore claimed that the society's records were confidential and that revealing the content of their discussions would violate the trust of other members. He suggested that the family had probably decided to take an impromptu vacation and would likely return within a few days. Even less helpful was Dr. Carr, claiming that patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing his recent conversations with Thomas. When Henley pointed out that missing persons investigations took precedence over normal confidentiality requirements, Dr. Carr reluctantly admitted that Thomas had been suffering from anxiety related to family pressures, but refused to elaborate on the specific nature of these pressures. The most forthcoming of the Historical Preservation Society members proved to be Mrs. Thornton, the librarian, though her information was more disturbing than helpful. She acknowledged that the group had been researching ancient religious practices, and that some members had become perhaps too enthusiastic about implementing their discoveries. When pressed for details, she mentioned that recent meetings had focused on what she called seasonal observances that were traditional in this area centuries ago. From an unexpected source came the breakthrough in Henley's investigation. Miss Sarah Collins, the school teacher, approached him 3 days after the disappearance with a collection of drawings that Billy Higgins had created during October. The drawings depicted robed figures gathered around what appeared to be an underground altar with symbols and arrangements that seemed far too sophisticated for an 8-year-old child to have invented. Miss Collins also provided Henley with essays that Margaret had written in the weeks before the disappearance. The essays dealt with topics such as the wisdom of ancient traditions and why modern people have forgotten important truths. The writing was technically excellent, but contained ideas and references that seemed to come from adult sources rather than a 12-year-old's imagination. Armed with evidence that the Historical Preservation Society was involved in activities far more serious than academic research, Sergeant Henley decided to search St. Mary's Church more thoroughly than his initial cursory investigation had allowed. What he discovered would transform the missing persons case into something far more sinister. First drawn to discrepancies in the church's architecture that he had noticed during his initial search, but hadn't considered significant, was Henley's attention. Certain walls seemed thicker than necessary, and there were spaces in the building's layout that didn't correspond to any visible rooms. When he measured the interior dimensions against the exterior walls, he found gaps that suggested the existence of hidden spaces. Confirmed when he discovered loose stones in the wall behind the altar were his suspicions. The stones had been carefully fitted to blend seamlessly with the surrounding masonry, but close examination revealed that they could be removed to reveal a passage leading downward into darkness. Narrow and steep, the passage was carved directly into the living rock beneath the church foundation. Unlike anything he had ever encountered in his 15 years of police work was the hidden chamber that Henley found at the bottom of the passage. Roughly circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, the space was with walls covered in symbols that appeared to be a mixture of Christian imagery and much older pagan markings. Of the same ancient stone as the church above was the floor, but arranged in a complex pattern that seemed to draw the eye toward a central altar. A massive block of black stone that clearly predated the Norman church by centuries was the altar itself. Its surface was stained with substances that Henley preferred not to identify, and it was surrounded by candles, dried herbs, and other materials that suggested recent use. Thick with the lingering scent of incense and something else, a metallic odor that made Henley's stomach turn, was the air in the chamber. But it was the personal belongings scattered around the chamber that confirmed Henley's worst fears about the fate of the Higgins family. On the altar lay Elelanina's wedding ring along with Thomas's pocket watch, Margaret's school ribbon, and Billy's favorite toy soldier. carefully arranged, as if they were offerings rather than simply discarded possessions, were the items. More disturbing than these personal effects were the documents that Henley found throughout the chamber. Handwritten journals, some dating back decades, described rituals and ceremonies that had been conducted in the underground space by successive generations of Ashworth residents. In Eleanina's distinctive handwriting were the most recent entries and revealed the true nature of the Historical Preservation Society's activities. A detailed account of how academic research had gradually transformed into something far more dangerous and obsessive was provided by Eleanor's journal entries dating from her first involvement with the Historical Preservation Society in 1964 through the final entry on October 30, 1965. Genuine intellectual curiosity about local traditions and folklore was shown by the early entries. But as months passed, the tone became increasingly reverential toward what Eleanor called the old wisdom and the true faith. By the spring of 1965, Eleanor's journal entries revealed that the Historical Preservation Society had moved far beyond theoretical research into what they called practical restoration of ancient religious practices. The group had convinced itself that modern Christianity had corrupted essential spiritual truths and that recovering older traditions was not just academically interesting but spiritually necessary for the community's well-being. Extensively about rituals that the group had begun performing in the hidden chamber, starting with simple seasonal celebrations and gradually progressing to more complex ceremonies that she claimed had been practiced in the Yorkshire Dales for thousands of years before Christianity arrived, wrote Eleanina. In loving detail, she described these rituals, emphasizing their beauty and spiritual power while glossing over aspects that might have concerned a more objective observer. The most disturbing entries dealt with what Eleanor called the harvest ceremony, a ritual that she claimed was essential for maintaining the spiritual protection of the community. According to her research, this ceremony required the participation of a complete family unit and could only be performed on specific dates when the barriers between worlds were thinnest. That she had convinced herself that her family had been chosen for a special role in preserving ancient traditions was revealed by Eleanina's final entries. She wrote about signs and portents that had appeared in recent weeks, suggesting that the time had come for the Higgins family to fulfill their spiritual obligations. Ecstatic and filled with religious fervor that bordered on mania was the tone of these entries. But it was the discovery of a second journal hidden beneath loose stones in the chamber floor that provided the most shocking revelations about what had really happened to the Higgins family and countless others before them. Bound in cracked leather and appearing much older than Eleanor's records was the hidden journal. The handwriting belonged to multiple authors spanning several decades with entries dating back to the 1920s. What Sergeant Henley found in these pages would reveal that the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society was not a recent aberration, but part of a conspiracy that had been operating for nearly 50 years. The earliest entries were written by Reverend Whitmore's predecessor, Father Michael Blackwood, who had served St. Mary's from 1919 until his mysterious death in 1942. His discovery of the underground chamber during renovation work and his fascination with the ancient symbols and artifacts he found there were described by Father Blackwood's initial entries. Like Whitmore after him, Blackwood had been an educated man with interests in archaeology and local history. However, a gradual descent into obsession and ultimately something far darker than academic research was revealed by Father Blackwood's journal. By the mid-1920s, he was writing about communications he believed he was receiving through meditation in the underground chamber. These communications allegedly provided instructions for rituals that would ensure the community's prosperity and protection from outside threats. Detailed descriptions of ceremonies that Father Blackwood claimed were based on authentic ancient traditions, but which were clearly his own inventions, influenced by his reading of occult literature and his growing psychological instability, were contained in the journal. Increasingly elaborate and demanding became the rituals, requiring specific participants chosen according to criteria that seemed to change based on Father Blackwood's personal whims and paranoid delusions. By 1928, the journal entries revealed that Father Blackwood had recruited a small group of followers who were willing to participate in his ceremonies. The group included many of the same family names that would later be involved in Reverend Whitmore's Historical Preservation Society, the Thorntons, the Carrs, the Weatherbys, and others. That they were part of an ancient bloodline chosen to preserve sacred knowledge had been convinced these families by Father Blackwood. The most horrifying entries described what Father Blackwood called the ultimate sacrifice, ceremonies that he claimed would ensure the community's protection, but which clearly involved the murder of entire families. The first such ceremony was conducted in October 1930 and involved the Morrison family, who had recently moved to Ashworth from Scotland. Clinical and matter-of-fact was Father Blackwood's description of their deaths, as if he were recording a routine religious observance rather than multiple murders. A consistent pattern that had been followed for decades was revealed by Henley's analysis of the journal entries. Every few years, Father Blackwood and later Reverend Whitmore would select a family for what they called spiritual elevation. The selection process was based on criteria that seemed designed to target families who were either new to the community or socially isolated in ways that would make their disappearance less likely to attract outside attention. The Morrison family in 1930 had been followed by the Hartwell family in